15th annual William A. Larson and Raymond Allmaras lecture series on emerging issues in soil and water. And I was not dilly-dallying, I was waiting for one of the family members. He's stuck on 494 coming over here. So we're going to get going, and when he comes in, we'll introduce him at that time. For some of you who don't know me, my name is Tish Gupta. I'm a Raymond R. Allmaras Professor of Emerging Issues in Soil and Water in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. We appreciate you guys taking time out of your busy schedule and coming and attending this lecture today. Before we go ahead and start the program, I'm going to introduce some of our guests over here. We have both Ray's family as well as we are expecting Bill's son. I think when I call your name, would you please just kind of wave your hand so people know who you are. We have Ray's daughter, Joan Allmaras. Joan came from Edmond, Oklahoma. We also have Kathleen Allmaras. Kathleen came from Seattle, Washington. Mary Allmaras. Mary came from Denver, Colorado. And Mary's son and Ray's grandson, Anthony Allmaras. They all have been attending for many years. Joan said 11 years. That's great. I think we also have Colleen Adamu, Ray's daughter, in California, live. I think she has been watching this proceeding every year. Steve Allmaras, Ray's son, is likely watching this event at MIT. He couldn't just get away from there. We have also Ray's sister, Camilla Lex. Camilla has been coming too for many years. And we have Ray's nephews, George McMahon and Joe McMahon. I'm not sure I'm saying your names. And we have Ray's niece, Adele, and her husband, Mike Jacoby. They're Minnesotans. We appreciate you guys taking time and coming. And I know it's a long ways for some of you guys, and but every time you come over here, it makes our event even more important. We also thank Ray's family for setting up the Raymond Allmaras Endowed Professorship, as well as supporting Ray Allmaras Graduate Student Fellowship, and also contributing to this lecture series. Let's give them a big hand. This is the counterpart series that we have in the fall, and Mark Seeley organizes that, and he's retiring next year, so we're going to miss him, but I think he has one more event next year. Mark has been also part of this series for 15 years, and he was instrumental in lining Mr. Aaron Buesing from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We really appreciate, Aaron, your coming here and making the presentation on the diversion project. We started this series mainly to highlight the expertise that we have in our department in the area of soil and water, as well as to recognize Bill Larson and Ray Allmaras' contributions to our disciplines. You can see there, maybe we got to turn the lights on somehow. Let me see, maybe more. All right, no, you might wait. They were always best buddies for many years, and I have worked with both of them, and it's been quite an honor to work with both of these guys over many years. As I mentioned, this is our 15th year, and we have displayed all the 15 years of poster outside in the foyer, so please at the break take time and have a look at it, see who was here. We have covered many different subject matters. We always had somebody from Minnesota in each one of those events, and it's been a fun series, and we hope that audience, the student, the faculty, agency personnel have got some knowledge out of these lecture series. It's been very important for me when I started it, and it's been very important for our department, and we appreciate your coming over here. The theme of this year's lecture is Lake Winnipeg. Many of you know that Minnesota is headwaters to three major watersheds. The Lake Winnipeg and Hudson Bay is one of those three watersheds. When we live in the cities here, away from rest of America, rest of Minnesota, we don't hear much about the issues that are outstate, and one of those issues is about the Red River Valley and what's going on. And so this year, we are going to highlight this issue of Lake Winnipeg and what's going on in the Fargo and Moorhead area. Today's program is a collective effort of many people. We have a committee that helps put together this program, and the committee members are Paul Capel, and their affiliation is listed over there. Fabian Fernandez from our department, Jane Johnson from USDA, ARS and Morris, Aline Murray from the agronomy department, Gary Sands from biosystem and bioengineering, Mark Seeley from our department, Jeff Strack from our department, and Bruce Wilson from biosystem and bioengineering. And my thanks to the committee, as well as to two important people in our department, Carrie Jerko and Stacy Nordstrom. I couldn't do this thing together without the committee and all the stuff that Mark Seeley, Fabian, and rest of the committee, and Carrie Jerko and Stacy Nordstrom has put together. The sponsor of this year's event, I don't know if you guys can see this, it's kind of got jumbled up, is the Minnesota Association of Professional Soil Scientists, and Benjamin Reckerson is the president, and then we also have the Spectrum Research Inc. Dr. Jim Bullock is the president of that, and we also get some funds from the Irene Truhan funds. And my sincere thanks to the sponsors. They have been steadfast sponsors and continuous support of what they've been doing for our program for this lecture. Now I request Dr. Carl Rosen to come over here and give a little update about the department. Yeah, you gotta get that.
Thanks, Satish. Yeah, my name is Carl Rosen. I'm department head of the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. It's always a pleasure to be here, and welcome to the 15th annual Larson Allmaras lecture. Thanks to both the Larson family as well as the Allmaras family for attending. I guess Larry's not here yet, but when he does, we'll introduce him then. But thanks for attending and supporting this series. This is an event that I do always look forward to, and this year is no exception. Having our colleagues from the University of Manitoba, as well as the Army Corps of Engineers, it's going to be a very exciting lecture series today. You know, it's going to talk a lot about the challenges facing water quality in Winnipeg as the water flows north from Minnesota. So we're very much involved with that challenge, so look forward to that. I want to give a few updates about the department. We're very fortunate in this department right now. First of all, I want to say Nick Jelinski's in the back there. He just received the Distinguished Teaching Award from the college. I just found that. Bodes well for the department when you have a young faculty member receiving a teaching award. So I think we're really in good shape with that. I want to talk a little bit about the funding that the legislature allocated recently. And it's a program called the Agricultural Research Extension Education Technology Transfer, AGREET for short. There's funding for about 20 tenure track faculty positions. And this is to increase the capacity in production agriculture. And so there'll be about 20 positions over the next 5 years hired. And I'm very happy to report that 3 of those positions have been allocated to this department for this coming year. The 3 positions are soil fertility precision nutrient management with a research and teaching appointment, a manure management specialist with an extension research appointment, and then probably the most important one and pertinent to this lecture, a nutrient and water management specialist for cropping systems who will be housed in the Northwest Research and Outreach Center in Crookston. So I think this person is going to help solve all your problems in Lake Winnipeg. I think that's the idea. So, So we also have a fourth position, and this is in partnership with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. It's an irrigation specialist. And that position, we're also in the process of interviewing for that one. And so we're looking forward to those. So all these four positions are currently being, we have the searches going on kind of simultaneously. So if you want to go to more seminars, I think we're going to have numerous opportunities for you to attend seminars over the next 3 to 4 weeks. It's going to be very good if you like going to lots of seminars. So it should be good. It's going to be great for the department. The Satish already mentioned. The one thing I do want to mention is that we hope to be able to fill another position, hopefully in the near future, and that's Mark Seeley's position. You know, he announced that he is going to retire. Don't know the date yet, Mark, but it is. It's I know it's imminent, within the next year. So no one can replace Mark, but there really is a need for communicating climate science. It's a high priority for the department, and I'm hoping that the college and the university understands that this is really important for the success not only of our department, but the university and college in general. So I'm working with some of the climate scientists to help get a position description together, and we're working on some strategies to try to get that position filled, and any support you can give towards that process, we greatly appreciate it. So with that, I'd like to thank Satish and his committee for all the work that they do to make this lecture series a success. And also, again, the Allmaras and Larson families, as well as the sponsors, Spectrum Research and the Minnesota Association for Professional Soil Sciences for their support. It's greatly appreciated, and I will now introduce the next speaker is Dr. Raymond, who's the Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Programs. Say a few words about college and other things.
Thank you very much, Carl. And I, on behalf of the College of Food, Agricultural, and Natural Resource Sciences, I want to echo both Carl and Satish in thanking both Bill and Ray's family for their generosity in making these things possible. When I looked into your program today and started to think about the work that this department does, it really struck home the importance of the land-grant mission. That very tenet that set forward the work we do at a university like this. And some of you know the story, but I think it also bears a little repeating. The land-grant mission, a lot of us think about research, but that was really not what brought it around. It was around teaching and access to education. And how do we make our country stronger by educating the populace? And I think it's really done great things. And in 1862, at the height of the Civil War, they passed the Morrill Act. And as I say, it was really about access to education. And we take that very seriously. In our college this year, we have 2,050 undergraduates. It's the most undergraduates that we've had in our college since we merged together. We have 700 graduate students, and we like to think about that as training the future's leaders. Carl already mentioned, we really have some exemplar teachers in this college. There's Nick and Jay Bell, who I was colleagues with until he decided to go back to teaching, and there's many more who help lead that educational process. Part of what we're doing as a college is putting out something we're calling a land-grant legacy. And we're making scholarships available to students from rural Minnesota, paying half the tuition for 4 years for them to come here in honor of that legacy and trying to, how do we take the works that we're doing here and increase the impact of them? Part of that effort is part of something we're calling Challenge 500. Right now we enroll about 350 undergraduates as freshmen every year, and our goal is to get 500. And we need your help in doing that. What we really need is people to come to the University of Minnesota and want to make this their home for education. And that's something that we can work on as a university, but we also need citizens around the state to help. We're engaging in an e-learning initiative, trying to make the things we do in this college more accessible to everybody. We like to think learning about food, agricultural, and natural resource sciences is part of any liberal education. In this day and age, people understanding these issues is important. as society feels more and more engaged in making those decisions. Last year, the undergraduates graduating from our college, 25% of them studied abroad at some point. We'd like to see that number higher, but it's part of engaging people in this broader global community. And 93% of our undergraduates found jobs or went on to higher education within 6 months. The second part of the land grant mission was called the Hatch Act, and that's the part we often think about, which is the research. That was 25 years later in 1887. If you think about the research focus of this department, soil, water, and climate, these things are fundamental to our society's future. How do we feed a growing world population and sustain our natural resources? The third part of the land grant mission is extension or outreach. I like to think about that as a visible example of the university's good works. Right now, Extension is bringing education, including climate and water education, information around commercial agriculture, drainage and water issues, and urban and suburban soils to agriculture, producers, other citizens in the state. As a global society, our understanding of soil and how complex microbial communities respond to management and inputs, to water, how we care for and protect our waters, and to climate, how our human activity impacts the world in which we must live, and ultimately will largely impact the lives of our grandchildren, is critical to our future. Much of this work is about understanding complexity. That is why we're going to learn about today in the story of Lake Winnipeg. This afternoon, we are here to honor Bill Larson and Ray Allmaras and gain strength from the work they did and the leadership they showed. We also get a glimpse into the breadth and complexity and importance of the work of the Soil, Water, and Climate Department. And I just hope you enjoy the afternoon. Thank you very much. Satish.
Cynthia Cashman here. Okay. Cynthia is going to take a few minutes and say a few words about them.
Sorry. Can everybody hear me? Just like this? Good. Oh, if you can hear me, then I don't need the microphone.
Cynthia,
Got
they're watching on the television. They can't.
Yeah, they,
Oh, but I'm in there.
Don't, you said,
Right
use
there.
the Satish's microphone.
All right. I tried. Okay. Hi, I'm Cynthia Cashman. I'm the Director of Development for the College of Food, Agricultural and Natural Resource Sciences, CFANS for those that don't know. It's good to be here, and it hasn't really been 11 years, Joan. I just,
2007 was the first year we played.
which year?
2007.
Okay, well, a lot's improved since then. I'm not improved, it was always great, but it just keeps getting better and better every single year. I will mention the chairs are a lot more comfortable now. Those wooden chairs, they were horrible, so I can actually sit back and relax. One thing I would like to do is put the spotlight on Satish. I don't know if you caught it. Well, you really want the spotlight. So, so I don't know if you caught it, but Satish is the first chair for the the first holder of the Ray Allmaras chair, and a very prestigious position to be in, thanks to the generosity of the Allmaras family. So. And the other thing I want to talk about, I just want to mention, is this lecture did not always have funding. But Satish made it happen. He went and knocked on doors and got funding originally. He will tell you the story someday. But because of all the generous donors that have given to it, it has pretty much become self-sustaining and continuing to improve year after year. So thank you for that. And anybody who would like to continue or give for the first time to this lecture or anything else with soil, water, and climate, please talk to me, or I am leaving gift envelopes right here. So all you have to do is fill it out and put a check in, or your credit card number. So thank you so much, Allmaras family, Larson family. Look at me, I have their pictures. I miss Ray and Bill so much. So Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia.
It's my privilege to introduce our first speaker. Mark Seeley is a longtime friend of Aaron Buesing, so it's really a special treat. Aaron has been with the District Office of the Army Corps of Engineers for 24 years. In 2015, he was awarded the Civil Servant of the Year Award. Pretty prestigious in the context of 650 employees in the district office. Very diligent, thorough, what else? Technical expertise. A straight shooter professionally. I can also tell you from firsthand experience, he's a straight shooter personally too, having gone to church with Aaron and his family for 20 years. So it's my privilege to introduce him. I know he'll give us a good piece of insight into the current situation with the Fargo-Moorhead diversion. And I understand that we'll be able to ask questions after all the speakers are done today. So if you have questions about that particular part of the program for Aaron, save them for a bit later. But for now, let us give a warm welcome to Aaron Buesing.
Thank you, Mark. We gotta switch the. In the meantime, I see Dr. Larry Larson is here. Larry is Bill's eldest son, and we surely appreciate your coming over here. I know the road was pretty tough. Well, you just made it in time. And at the same time, I also want to mention that Bill's granddaughter, Alicia Lee, she might be watching it live. And she's doing research on conservation biology in South Africa. So I always hear from her in the last 2-3 years whenever I send her the email. It's also likely that Steve Larson, which is Bill's second son, he's in Chicago. He might be watching, and Suzanne Larson, Bill's daughter, she's in California. She's a professor, just like many people here in the room, and she can't get away from her teaching. She might be watching. So we thank you. Let's give them a big hand.
It's not switching over.
It's not, okay. And I also didn't say thank you to Associate Dean Greg. Greg, thank you very much for coming and saying a few words about it. We appreciate it.
We're working on the technical side of it. Just a little background. I grew up on a farm out in rural southwestern Minnesota, near Linda, Minnesota, near Marshall, Minnesota. Attended the University of Minnesota Morris campus for my first 2 years, and then finished my civil engineering degree here at the Twin Cities. As Mark was way too kind for one thing, but I've been working with the Corps for the most part since 1991. I had a couple-year hiatus in there, but I've been back since I was gone in 95, 96 and 97, was back in the fall of 97, and I've been there ever since. I've been working on the Fargo project since late 2010, and sure, most of you know it's a project not without controversy. We had our first groundbreaking ceremony last week in Fargo, started the diversion inlet structure. I'm going to give you just a summary of what this project entails. Oh, forgot.
So just quick background, 45,000 square miles total drainage area, Red River Basin, 6,800 square miles upstream of Fargo, so about 15% of the watershed is upstream of Fargo. Just past flooding events in Fargo-Moorhead and what it took to fight those floods. This is the 1997 flood, peak stage of just under 40 feet, 14 miles of sandbags, 22 miles of temporary levees, just a lot of work that went into it in 97. In 2009, a lot of work had been done since 97, but still 42 miles of temporary levees, 19 miles of sandbag. The stage was about a foot higher than it was in 1997. So Fargo has fought valiantly in a number of floods, 2010 and 11. So far they've been successful, but we fear that chances are someday they wouldn't be successful. This is the existing 100-year floodplain for Fargo. Doesn't look too bad. What's important to understand here is this is based on 1970s hydrology. This is what the flood insurance maps use today. And it does need to be updated. The Corps has updated the hydrology as part of this project. This is a more realistic view of what the floodplain looks like through Fargo-Moorhead for a 100-year event. Again, we all need to keep in mind a 100-year event is an event that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. It's not a flood that occurs necessarily once every 100 years. Just a look at the historic record. On the left column, we've got discharge in cubic feet per second, years in the bottom. 2009 flood was a flood of record, 97 was a close second. The 69 flood, there was actually a flood in 1897 that was very close to the 1997 flood. But 6 of the 13 major floods have occurred since 1990. The Corps' analysis of the hydrology, we've actually truncated the period of record since 1942. There's certainly some controversy with that, but that's what we felt was, we had an expert panel take a look at it. This wet cycle wasn't necessarily attributed to any particular cause, but it was recognized, and our hydrology is based on a period of record from 1942 through 2000, well, to present. 100-year event, slightly larger than what's occurred historically, although I'm going to explain what happens just upstream of Fargo a little bit when talking about these historic floods. And then a 500-year flood is up over 60,000 CFS, and when I explain the project operation, I'll talk about these events a little bit. So just keep in mind the magnitude of these events. So during feasibility, a number of alternatives were considered. Looked at a diversion on the Minnesota side, looked at a few different alignments, looked at diversions on the North Dakota side, looked at levees through town with upstream retention, looked at upstream retention on its own also. Anyway, a number of alternatives were looked at during feasibility. And actually my slide order isn't quite right here. What was selected was a diversion on the North Dakota side. And that's both what North Dakota wanted and Minnesota wanted. A diversion by itself, this is where my slides were out of order, what happens downstream, what's in blue is existing condition discharge, the solid blue line. The red solid red line is with project discharge. What happens is that diversion channel brings water around the cities faster and it combines with the tributary peaks, and you end up with downstream impacts. The lines with the markers are stage. So again, you've got a discharge impact and a related stage impact. Again, here's the project. What is key with this project is storing water upstream to minimize those downstream impacts. So there's roughly an area upstream of about 34,000 acres that will be impacted by this project. So there's no doubt that a project like this, there are people that benefit, but there are also people that are severely impacted. But there's a mitigation plan effort to mitigate for those damages, but we certainly recognize that people are impacted by this project. The project consists of a dam. That dam spans about 12 miles east to west. Here's downtown Fargo. The dam is quite a ways upstream. A 30-mile long diversion channel. That diversion channel it crosses four rivers. Two rivers will continue to cross over the diversion, so the diversion will go under the Cheyenne River and the Maple River. So aqueduct structures, basically a bridge over the top of the aqueduct, will convey base flows, roughly 1.5-year type flows, into the benefited area, with extra flood flows being diverted into the diversion project. Along the diversion, other little drains, the Rush River and the lower Rush River, will be captured completely by the diversion project. Back up a second. At the upstream end of the project, control of this pool will be controlled by 3 structures, one on the Red River structure, one on the Wild Rice, and an inlet structure to the diversion. Those structures will all be Tainer gate structures that look essentially like these. The diversion channel will look something like this. We'll have a low flow channel at the bottom. That channel will have some meandering, at least along the lower portion of the diversion channel. There will be a levee on the right bank, the east bank, separating the diversion channel from the benefited area. Recreation and maintenance concerns will also be addressed in the design. The aqueducts, here's the structure that allows base flows into the benefited area. Again, basically a bridge, and then excess flows are diverted in to the diversion. This is just a rendering, an artist's rendering of what that aqueduct structure may look like. We've done all sorts of modeling as part of this project. This is a physical model done by the University of Minnesota's St. Anthony Falls Laboratory down in Rosemount. So we've done one-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional numerical modeling and physical modeling. Again, this is looking at the 100-year floodplain, existing conditions, core hydrology. I hate to call it core hydrology, it's really up-to-date hydrology. And this is what it's going to look like with the project. And the colors are a little bit hard to see. The goal, and we've done modeling to demonstrate this, west of the diversion, the goal is to have essentially no impacts for the 100-year flood. Obviously, in this area, we're going to be ponding excess water, and what you see in the lighter red are areas that are impacted. The geomorphology study was done as part of this, was completed in September of 2012. Just existing channel migration rates, a lot of clays, very low gradient. They're up in the order of a few inches per year. Conclusion of that report, the project is not expected to cause major channel plan form or cross-section geometry changes. Of course, a poor design, you could get it wrong, but that, if we do things right, that's the expectation. However, you know, we're human. A monitoring plan is being developed. Make sure that we aren't finding something caused by the project. The plan is being developed in cooperation with both the state of Minnesota and North Dakota. We actually had a meeting on that this morning. Just a quick rundown of how this project has gone so far, just an abbreviated timeline. Feasibility started in 2008. Feasibility report and EIS completed in 2011. Record of decision signed in Washington, April 2012. Authorized by Congress in 2014. And again, we had our first groundbreaking ceremony last week. There's a website, lots of information about the project. Certainly, please check it out if you have interest in time. And thank you very much for including me in the lecture series today. My honor.
We appreciate your coming. We're going to change the computer booth. So our featured speakers are Dr. David Lobb and Dr. Flaten. Since they are going to be delivering their lectures one after the other, I'm going to introduce both of them together. I met both of them about 4 or 5 years ago, I think, Don, when we had a Tri-Society meeting. Don, Dr. Flaten organized a Tri-Society meeting. The societies were the Canadian Society of Soil Science, Canadian Society of Forestry, am I right? Yeah. And the Manitoba Society of Soil Science. Dr. David Lobb is a professor in the Department of Soil Science at the University of Manitoba, where his teaching and extension activities are in the area of soil erosion, soil and water conservation, and sustainable agriculture. David also holds the position of Senior Research Chair in the Watershed Science Systems, in which he focuses on the water quality problems in Lake Winnipeg and their solution within its watersheds. He is recognized nationally and internationally for his research on tillage translocation and tillage erosion, and has received numerous awards, including membership in the Canadian Conservation Hall of Fame, a fellowship in the Canadian Society of Soil Science, and several awards from the Soil Science Society of America and the Soil and Water Conservation Society. Just this week, David just got the news that he'll be receiving the 2016 Alexander Bajakova Award next week from the Lake Winnipeg Foundation during their annual meetings. It's next week at the meeting. The annual award is named in memory of pioneer fisheries biologist Alexander Bajkov, one of his first people to study Lake Winnipeg. The award is given to someone who exemplifies Dr. Bajkov's dedication to the understanding of Lake Winnipeg and who demonstrates outstanding efforts to protect and restore the lake and its watershed. Dr. Don Flaten is also a professor in the Department of Soil Science at the University of Manitoba. Don specializes in soil fertility, crop nutrition, and nutrient management with a focus on agricultural phosphorus management from agronomic and environmental point of view. Don's research interests include the effect of fertilizer and livestock manure on crop uptake, yield and quality, as well as the effects of these and other management practices on agricultural and environmental sustainability in farming systems. Don has received several awards for his efforts to improve soil and nutrient management practices in the northern Great Plains region of Canada, including the Soil Science for Society Award from the Canadian Society of Soil Science and the Saskatchewan Soil Conservation Association Award of Merit. The title of the joint lecture is Sources of Sediment and Phosphorus to Lake Winnipeg, Matching Causes with Cures. Please welcome Dr. Lobb.
Gonna make sure everything's all set up here. Green light's flashing, and I can hear myself, so that's good. Okay. Great. Thank you all for being here, and I would really like to thank the organizers for inviting Don Flaten and I to present today. It's a very prestigious lecture, and I'm very honored to be here, and I'm sure Don is as well. And I just want to make one note about my connection with Dr. Larson and Allmaras. And it goes back to 1985 when I was an undergraduate student studying at the University of Toronto. And I did a term paper on soil conservation. I remember reading their work at that time. So it goes back quite a long time. So I thought I'd make that mention for the family. As well, I followed their work throughout the career. Being a member of the Soil and Water Conservation Society, I certainly did follow their work throughout their career until their retirement recently and passing. And today's presentation with Don and I, as Satish said, is Sources of Sediments and Phosphorus in Lake Winnipeg. And Don and I are tackling quite a broad scope of things, quite a lot of ground to cover, so we're tag teaming, as Satish said. In the first part of the presentation, I'm going to be focusing on some background to Lake Winnipeg and also looking at soil erosion and sedimentation more specifically. In the second part, Don's going to focus on phosphorus and then provide some thoughts on where things are headed in terms of the science and practices and policy. Water is certainly an extremely important resource for all of us. Water has been extremely important to our civilization through transportation, availability issues, droughts and floods, as we just heard about, and that'll come up again in the presentation. In recent history, the interest in water has become increasingly focused on water quality. And notable, certainly in terms of my career, was the attention drawn by the eutrophication of Lake Erie back in the 1960s and 1970s. And I suspect you probably know the gentleman on the left. The gentleman on the right is the father of our current Prime Minister. And certainly, water quality is certainly an issue that captures our headlines. This is from Minnesota's Star Tribune paper. And it continues to capture the headlines and throughout the region, and it also connects us in terms of our common interest in surface water, and even made the newspapers and the Star Tribune again in terms of its impact on Lake Winnipeg and other freshwater water bodies throughout the region. So now I'd like to give you a bit of background on Lake Winnipeg, because many of you may have some idea of what lake or where Lake Winnipeg is and a bit of its characteristics, but I'd like to go through some of them in detail as they relate to issues of water quality in our presentation. It's the 6th largest freshwater lake in Canada. It's the 10th largest freshwater lake in the world. It has an area of 9,300 square miles, which is quite large. It has a length of over 240 miles from north to south and a width of 60 miles. And the average depth is only 40 feet. It's relatively shallow. In terms of the area, pointing out Lake Winnipeg, that is Lake Winnipeg right there, but if you consider Lake Winnipegosis and Lake Manitoba, which are also part of that lake system, it's about 15,000 square miles. And to put it in context to Lake Erie, which I mentioned previously, Lake Erie is only about 9,900 square miles. So this is still quite a large lake and lake system. Another important point about the lake is it lies on a lacustrine plain. It's remnant of glacial Lake Agassiz. And Lake Agassiz existed at its height and what we think of as its last major influence in the region about 8,000, 12,000 years ago when the deglaciation occurred. And this becomes a very important feature in terms of the soils, but also in terms of the environmental processes and water and Now, this is showing Lake Agassiz in its full extent about 10,000 years ago. It's quite a large lake, as I just mentioned, and it actually did extend much further east and west prior to that period. But at this point, near the end of the glaciation, you can see where it actually flowed south via the Mississippi River, and then as deglaciation occurred, it started to flow to the east via Lake Superior, and ultimately flowed north to Hudson's Bay through what we now think of as Lake Winnipeg. And Satish also mentioned the fact that this flows north to Hudson Bay as well. And it's also bounded on the west by what we refer to as the Manitoba escarpment. This is a feature which is common to Minnesotans, North Dakotans, Manitobans, and Saskatchewans, or Saskatchewaners. I'm not sure. Don being from Saskatchewan, I'm not sure how you refer to them. But it's a large feature which will come up in my presentation talking about sedimentation, but it is a feature that is quite significant in terms of the overall hydrology of the region. Lake Winnipeg supports a modest fishery of about $16 million per year, and it's trying to switch everything into imperial rather than leaving it metric. I think it's roughly about $16 million US per year. Multi-million dollar recreation industry, which is usually what captures people's attention in terms of Lake Winnipeg. That's where a lot of people in Winnipeg go for recreation, is to Lake Winnipeg for the beaches. And it also supports a multi-million dollar hydroelectric industry, and much of that electricity actually gets shipped south to support the United States. And looking at the watershed, it's a very large watershed. The basin, the Lake Winnipeg Basin, spans 4 provinces, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and it also touches on 4 states, including Minnesota and North Dakota, most notably. And it does so via the Winnipeg River, and the Red River, Assiniboine River, and the Saskatchewan River. It extends east by the Winnipeg River to the Canadian Shield in Ontario. It extends west through what we refer to as the Prairie Pothole region, represented by these landscapes that you find in North Dakota, Saskatchewan, and in Alberta via the Assiniboine River and the Saskatchewan River, and extends further west by the Saskatchewan River to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains out in Alberta. And it also extends south via the Red River into North Dakota and Minnesota. The runoff from these 4 rivers impact Lake Winnipeg, and they also continue on to impact Hudson Bay as well as the Arctic Ocean. So some of the work I do looks at not only the impacts of sediment and associated contaminant movement to Lake Winnipeg, but also looks on how the impacts of that watershed move north into Hudson Bay and into the Arctic in general. Looking at the watershed, it's the 2nd largest watershed in Canada. It has an area of about 380,000 square miles. It has an arid to subhumid climate, drier than Minnesota. Has a runoff dominated by snowmelt, becomes a very important issue that Don Flaten will touch on in his presentation. It's a relatively level landscape, particularly in the Red River Valley, but also the Regina Plain, and in general, the hummocky landscape of the Prairie is still relatively flat by comparison to other physiographic regions in North America. And it's home to about 6.6 million people on both sides of the border. There's a lot of people there. And these conditions can conspire, as we'll talk about, to create some serious water resources problems. And a few more numbers to put it in perspective. About 50% of the land area in the watershed is agricultural land, so it's dominated by agriculture. And about $15 billion US in the agricultural industry in Canada, and that's a few years out of date. And if you think about the overall, that's just in Manitoba alone, and in terms of the United States and the Canadian parts, it's about, $1.5 billion US in Manitoba alone, and about $15 billion US through the whole watershed. Now, in the Lake Winnipeg Basin, we face 2 major challenges in managing our surface waters. One is flooding, which was just mentioned in the previous presentation, and eutrophication. Now, with respect to flooding, we frequently have aerial flooding of land throughout the watershed during snowmelt and heavy rainfall, and that results in a tremendous amount of crop losses. And in Manitoba alone, that ends up costing would cost tens of millions of dollars per year on average due to crop insurance claims. It's a tremendous amount of money that's lost on an annual basis due to aerial flooding. And this is different than the catastrophic flooding was referred to earlier, which is very rare, but when it occurs, it's quite significant and can result in tremendous amount of infrastructure damage that can ultimately result in hundreds of millions of dollars of damage. With respect to eutrophication, nutrients from the watershed enter the surface water, causing their eutrophication and consequently algae blooms in water bodies such as Lake Winnipeg. And this is a pretty extreme image, but this happens regularly and multiple times in the summer, where you get the lake being actually fairly well covered by green algae and fouling the beaches. Now, although it's most observable from above, and we have lots of nice satellite images now that show pictures like that on a regular basis, it's probably most obvious and most of an issue when it's impacting the beaches and impairs the beaches. And in 2013, Lake Winnipeg earned the title of the most threatened lake in the world by the Global Nature Fund. So it's actually recognized internationally as quite a serious issue, this issue of eutrophication and algae blooms and the potential impacts it has on the ecosystem through toxins, as well as just ultimately changing the food web and impacting the whole ecosystem. As well, there's a linkage between flooding and eutrophication. This touches on the previous presentation. Within days to weeks of flooding, the soils turn anoxic and release phosphorus from the soils, elevating the P levels in those waters that are overlying the land. And this becomes quite a significant issue because when those flood waters recede, they carry that additional phosphorus downstream and impact the lake, resulting in issues such as this. So it's not just the water in terms of the quantity, it's also the quality of the water has to be considered when flooding land through things such as diversions. Also, there's considerable uncertainty in our present understanding of the nature and the magnitude of these challenges, both flooding and eutrophication, and therefore there's considerable weakness in our ability to predict and manage them effectively, particularly on the ecological side of things. And the uncertainty is expected to grow with changing climate. A lot of the changes that are occurring, and maybe also seen in some of the data you're showing in terms of the flows in the red, can be related to climate change. There is concern that there has been increasing amount of flows in the Red River due to increasing amounts of precipitation, and that may intensify, but certainly the variability is going to increase. Now, with respect to eutrophication of the lake, there are a number of phosphorus sources to consider, and this is just a graphic illustration that was generated from data from between 1994 and 2001. It has been updated, but the numbers are almost identical in the more recent version of it, so I just left the original schematic. And if you look at the distribution here, you can see the Red River is the major source. Now the Red River here also includes the Assiniboine River, because the Assiniboine River is really just a catchment of the Red, and they actually come together, the confluence is in the center of Winnipeg. And beyond Winnipeg, then they flow north as the Red River, so they're combined in this analysis. And you can see the Winnipeg River to the east and the Saskatchewan River to the north and west, and a bit of atmospheric deposition as well. And if you break the Red River down into the American and Canadian components, or Manitoba components, you can see a fairly large portion that's actually coming from the American side of the Red River, but you have to keep in mind that there's, in terms of the Red River proper, there's the vast majority of the Red River lies in the on the American side of the border. There's actually a concern that the most intensive losses are actually occurring on the Canadian side, or the Manitoba portion. And in terms of attributing sources, if you look at this bottom schematic over here, it shows the breakdown further in terms of the sources, whether they be rural or urban and industrial, and you can see that rural tends to be fairly a large portion of those losses from the Red River Valley, and that's probably true on both sides of the border. You have to keep in mind that the rural also includes not just farmland, includes everything in the rural environment. And that's some of the small municipalities as well as the cropland and natural land where phosphorus can be released from. Now, a lot of attention has been placed on agriculture as a major cause of these problems, or this crisis, and simply due to the prevalence of the agricultural land, it has to be a major contributor to runoff and sediment nutrients associated with that runoff. And it's certainly going to be considered a contributor to the problem or the crisis, and it also needs to be considered to be part of the solution. So in other words, the resolution for these issues related to water quality and water quality are going to be dealt with through management practices in agriculture. Historically, much of the effort in agriculture to protect surface water has been on the reduction of water erosion within farm fields. That's what I got involved in when I started my career. And also wind erosion, and the extent that wind erosion and the dust associated with it is also a source of sediments and nutrients entering waterways, as was noted in that pie chart or graphic. The belief being that if you reduce soil erosion, you reduce sediments and pollutants being delivered to waterways. That's a major focus. The presumption is what is occurring on the ag land is making sediments move through the waterways and ultimately impacting a lake or freshwater system, the Lake Winnipeg in this particular case. And to control water and wind erosion, considerable efforts have gone into developing and promoting and adopting conservation practices such as conservation tillage and cover cropping within the Prairie region, Lake Winnipeg Basin, and across North America. The practices leave the soil covered with plants and plant residues, and the intent is to have them covered more completely with greater duration, particularly during highly erosive periods. Now, my work. Over the last 30 years, I've conducted several studies across Canada on the causes of soil erosion at the field scale in an attempt to better understand how to control and protect our soil and water resources. And more recently, that has extended into sedimentation, looking at sedimentation at the watershed scale, again with sites across North America. And I have pointed at one in particular that both Dawn and I will be showing illustrations from, and that's South Tobacco Creek watershed, which is just southwest of Winnipeg, right on the edge of the Manitoba escarpment, on the edge of the Red River Basin. And this is showing South Tobacco Creek watershed. It's about 28 square miles and has about 40 landowners in that watershed. In this watershed, there's a tremendous amount of sediment exported downstream to Lake Winnipeg, and there's many other watersheds like it. The work on this particular watershed started back in 1961 when the federal government was looking at flows and sediments coming off of these types of watersheds. And my work on soil erosion began there about 19, 20 years ago, and much of that work recently has been focused on sediment fingerprinting, specifically looking at where the sediments are coming from using fingerprinting techniques, which is really use of multiple tracers to identify where the sediments is coming from. And in those studies, we have collected sediment using a number of techniques. This is showing one here we refer to as a time-integrated sediment trap. We've used a number of techniques to collect sediment moving through this watershed from the upper reaches, the small catchments up here, the green circles being where we have our sediment collection stations, down through the watershed, cutting across the escarpment, which is shown here, down through to the town of Miami, and then down beyond that to the Red River and ultimately Lake Winnipeg. And in those areas where we have the sediment traps, we've also collected sediment source material, that being soils from agricultural land, riparian areas, stream bank material, as well as, in this case, rock outcrops associated with the escarpment. And all of those samples are analyzed for a variety of properties which serve as tracers for the purposes of fingerprinting. Then I should show you some of the data from the radiochemical and geochemical tracers in this watershed, South Tobacco Creek, and I'm just going to show you some data going from this upper reach, which is the first station. The first station up here, down through the watershed, as in the previous illustration, down towards Miami, the outlet of that watershed. And this is showing the data associated with radiochemical and geochemical tracers which we've published. And when you look at the upper reaches, station 1, you see that the sediments that are entering in the smallest catchments in the upper reaches of the watershed are largely topsoil. But as you move towards the outlet, there's a major shift where you start very high levels of topsoil in the small watersheds, but as you move towards the outlet, there's less and less topsoil. And what happens is you see a shift towards more material coming from the shales associated with the escarpment, as well as subsoil associated with the stream bank. And this is probably most obvious when you look at color of the sediment. This is showing buckets of sediment from that first station as we move down through the watershed, and you can see this is a very small stream associated with the upper reaches of the watershed. and topsoil dominates the sources of sediment. And as you move downstream to larger and larger watersheds, you get down towards the middle of the watershed and you're cutting through the escarpment, and there's a fairly dramatic shift in sources of sediment from topsoil dominated to shale and subsoil dominated material associated with the stream bank. And as you move down lower in the watershed, these aren't big streams by any means, and move towards the outlet by Miami, you can see you have this very light colored material, which is essentially the same color material associated with the subsoils and the bedrock. And so we've actually used color as a fingerprint or a tracer in the fingerprinting process as well. And when we did that, we found actually a little more drastic results using color, where in the upper parts of the watershed, again, station 1 being the upper parts of the watershed, you have a large amount of topsoil in the sediments in those small catchments at the top of the watershed. But as you move down towards the bottom of the watershed, going from S1 to S6, whether it's topsoil from above the escarpment or topsoil, and this is associated with the stream bank material, you have essentially no topsoil leaving that watershed. Whereas if you look at the other sources, the stream bank, subsoil, and shale outcrops, it accounts for the vast majority of the material leaving the watersheds. So it's interesting to me academically, but it is of practical importance. So the vast majority of sediments in the lower reaches of the watershed are from channel bank and channel bed erosion, and it's about 70 to 90% of the material leaving the watershed is from that channel erosion process. This is quite in contrast to what I would have learned as an undergraduate student, where we were told it was about the other way around. You have about 85% coming from topsoil and 15% from channel erosion. It's actually the reverse. And that's because of the exposed bedrock outcrops. This is showing one of the outcrops of many of these associated with channels flowing through the escarpment. And we have similar findings now in our studies in New Brunswick, Quebec, British Columbia, and elsewhere in Manitoba, because we've replicated the study elsewhere in Manitoba. There's also a study in the Minnesota River watershed which shows fairly similar results as well. From these findings, we've concluded the management practices to reduce soil erosion and sediment delivery to waterways may have little effect on siltation and delivery of P-rich sediments to surface waters. And furthermore, to reduce sediment levels in waterways and delivery to water bodies, we must manage the runoff to reduce the erosive stream flow. So it's looking at managing the runoff rather than managing water erosion on the farm fields, because it's the runoff that really matters. In hindsight, looking at the escarpment, the influence of the escarpment, this is showing a cross-section of the escarpment with the channel profile and the escarpment profile. There's a tremendous amount of geologic erosion that occurs and has been occurring since deglaciation as channels cut through the escarpment, and they are going to deliver a tremendous amount of sediment downstream through the Red River system as well into Lake Winnipeg. And this is not just an isolated problem with this particular watershed. To give you some sense of the scope of this, South Tobacco Creek, which is right in there, that little dot, the escarpment-like features in that particular watershed account for about 10 miles of length. If you look at the larger watershed, the watershed that's delivering sediments to Lake Winnipeg and ultimately to Hudson Bay, there's about 30,000 miles of those types of features, and generating that type of sediment and delivering it downstream into the waterways and water bodies. So it's actually a widespread problem. We now believe this is probably the major source of sediments throughout the watershed system. It's not water erosion from ag land. So that leaves us with some questions. If the majority of sediment in our surface waters are not coming from agricultural land, we must ask a few questions. These are a bit controversial. They're meant to be a bit provocative. First, are wind and water erosion really responsible for the severe soil loss observed on agricultural land? And what is the cause of the severe soil loss that is prevalent throughout the region? And how important are soil conservation practices for protecting soil, or for protecting surface water quality, if there isn't that connection? So, the work on soil erosion, severe soil erosion, related to those questions. Contemporary and historical soil loss is widespread throughout the region. Soil loss is often severe, and its impact on soil health is quite persistent. You go into sites that have been under soil conservation practices for many years, you still see the tremendous impact of past soil erosion. And you get situations such as this. This is actually from near Fergus Falls, Minnesota. And you see soil such as this where you have a tremendous loss of organic matter on the hilltops. It's not moisture, it's actually soil organic matter. And that has a huge impact on all properties and processes associated with the soil. Obviously, biophysical processes such as crop production are quite important, impacting economics. Where you do not have topsoil, you do not have healthy soil, you are not going to generate healthy crops either. And our research has actually demonstrated that wind and water erosion are not the causes of these severe soil losses. They do occur, wind and water erosion, and they contribute to off-farm export of sediment and delivery of sediment to surface waters, but they're not the major source of sediments. And they also don't account for the observed rates of patterns of soil loss within these fields where you see this type of severe soil loss, which is widespread through hilly areas such as Minnesota and Manitoba. In studies carried out across Canada and elsewhere in the world, one of those studies being near Morris, Minnesota, it has been found that tillage erosion is the cause, not wind and water erosion, the cause for the severe soil losses, the ones that people, the farmers are trying to manage. And tillage erosion, just to explain what that is, it's the net redistribution of soil resulting from the variability in soil movement by tillage. I'll expand on that in a minute, but I did want to point out, when you look at topographically hilly landscape with this simple graphic, when you're tilling, represented by the arrows, you end up generating net losses of material on the hilltop, that's soil loss, and net accumulation on these concave areas at the bottom of slopes. But what is very important is understanding that tillage erosion is caused by the variability, either in how much or how far the soil is moved. It becomes quite important, particularly as we look at illustrations such as this. The moldboard plow, which is the elimination of the moldboard plow has been the focus of soil conservation efforts for many years. People have equated the moldboard plow with degradation of soil. But as it turns out, when you look at the soil movement and you compare the moldboard plow to things such as chisel plows and vertical equipment, vertical tillage equipment, you find out that the chisel plow and equipment such as that tend to move about twice as much or are twice as erosive as the moldboard plow. So what we think of as conservation tillage is not necessarily conservation tillage when it comes to severe soil losses. When you compare it to secondary tillage, such as tandem disc and field cultivators, they also can move a lot of soil with a lot of variability, and actually the tandem disc is about twice as erosive as the moldboard plow. When you compare it to things we don't even often think of as tillage, such as, in this case, potato hillers and potato harvesters, it is the most severe in terms of erosivity of any of the implements. We found, looking at potato production in New Brunswick, that what we refer to as tertiary equipment, the post-seeding equipment, is about 3 times more erosive, well actually more than 3 times more erosive than the moldboard plow. Even seeding, because it is moved, or the soil is moved with a lot of speed and a lot of variability in that speed. It's not the amount of soil, it's how far it's moved. It varies so much that in 2 separate studies, one in Manitoba, one in Saskatchewan, we found high disturbance seeders to be as erosive as the moldboard plow. In other words, they continue to scrape soil off hilltops and never allow the soil to regenerate the way we'd like it to. A few implications associated with that. Tillage erosion results in severe soil losses, and to give you some idea of the magnitude, typically around 10 to 50 tons per acre per year. On large areas, as much as 15 to 30%. And if you drive along the interstate between here and Fergus Falls, you'll find that this is true. If you take a look at it, take pictures of it, you'll find that you get illustrations such as this. This is also from Fergus Falls. Tillage erosion causes more redistribution within many landscapes than wind or water erosion, including wind erosion in the prairies and water erosion in more humid environments. And tillage erosion exposes subsoil which is highly erodible to wind and water erosion. This is important because this interaction between the erosion process does actually link tillage erosion to water erosion and sediment delivery from farm fields. So there is actually a connection to water quality. As well, tillage erosion acts as a major delivery mechanism for water erosion, delivering soil to convergent areas of the landscape where overland flow concentrates and ultimately causes things such as rills and gullies and delivers sediment to waterways. This is another significant interaction that needs to be considered when looking at soil conservation. And just to back up on that, just to point out that when we look at erosion processes now in Canada and planning, we look at the integration of them. We look at wind, water, and tillage erosion in combination to try and come up with more integrated approaches to soil conservation. And just a few final thoughts. The major causes of severe soil erosion in farmland is tillage erosion, not wind and water, which I said. To control tillage erosion, we must focus on practices to control soil movement, not necessarily improve vegetative cover, because it's really the soil movement that is actually the problem where we have severe soil losses. In terms of the sediment, the major source of sediment being exported from agricultural watersheds is channel erosion in this region, not soil erosion. To control channel erosion, we must focus on practices to control runoff, not practices that control water erosion within farm fields. And final point, which is also a bit controversial, because we've always tried to put soil quality and water quality together in a nice, neat package. In reality, protecting soil quality through soil conservation practices may not necessarily protect water quality. They are not directly linked. They are indirectly linked, but not directly linked, and there are problems when you try to simplify the system as all responding the same way positively to soil conservation practices. As Don Flaten will mention, in fact, soil conservation practices, some of them may actually threaten water quality. And final point relating it to soil health, and on a bit of a positive note, a healthy soil is one that's rich in organic matter, and by having higher levels of organic matter and better structure, you certainly improve the water characteristics of the soil, increasing infiltration, water storage, and drainage from that soil system. And that is ultimately going to be extremely important for reducing runoff from agricultural fields. So even though you may not consider soil conservation important in terms of soil erosion and water and sediment, it can be very important for managing runoff, which again I would argue is probably the key thing looking at water quality. And practices that improve soil health, just to expand on that just a little bit, growing crops that produce lots of biomass and improve the soil, organic matter and structure are going to be very important for improving those characteristics around soil and water. Encouraging diverse and abundant communities of soil organisms to allow that organic matter to be incorporated in the soil naturally is quite important. Reducing wind, water, and tillage erosion are obviously going to be important if you're going to try and build soil organic matter and create that healthy system that manages the water better. And one last point, which I'm not going to show you any slides on, but there is one other practice which has been studied in South Dakota, Minnesota, and in Manitoba, and that's use of soil landscape restoration, which is moving soil back to those eroded hilltops, in part because it improves the soil water characteristics on those landscape positions, improving crop growth, and ultimately will also reduce runoff downstream, off the field and downstream. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Don Flaten, who's going to carry on to the second part.
It does for you folks through your own local newspaper. As David mentioned, the issue of water quality really hits people in the face when their favorite beach gets covered with algae like this. This was actually in the United Nations Environmental Program's 2011 annual report. Lake Winnipeg made that issue of their environmental program report. So a lot of problems with Lake Winnipeg, and the big problem is phosphorus. This has to be present at extremely low concentrations, 20 to 50 parts per billion, and you get this proliferation of algae growth, and it creates all these bad problems. So phosphorus, the key issue, and the phosphorus in Lake Winnipeg is not coming from one main source. It's coming from a diversity of sources, and there's a bit of a blame game going on, who's got the biggest contribution, but really each of us needs to look within our own community and decide, how can we reduce our share of that loading to Lake Winnipeg? And agriculture has that responsibility as well. So I'm going to discuss with you some of the ideas we have about agriculture and phosphorus loss, from the Manitoba point of view. First of all, we have to understand the processes of phosphorus loss from agricultural land. This is a classic diagram from Andrew Sharpley's work. and you can have a bit of phosphorus leaching. It isn't a major issue unless you've got tile drainage. Manitoba does not have a lot of tile drainage. There's the release of soil and plant phosphorus to the dissolved portion of nutrients in the water during runoff. And then, of course, there's erosion of particulate phosphorus. And when Andrew and his colleagues at U.S. Department of Agriculture, and now he's at University of Arkansas, have reviewed this issue for the U.S. environment, they figure that and calculate that really erosion is the biggest problem with phosphorus loss across most of the continental United States, at least for their situation or for your situation in the U.S. And a lot of that work that's been done on phosphorus loss has been done in sloping landscapes like this. This is where Andrew used to be at USDA Center in Pennsylvania. And it's a relatively wet environment. It's warm. Most of the runoff is from rainfall, and the slopes are steep. So they've got a lot of challenges there with water erosion, and it results in a lot of phosphorus loading. If we take a look at a typical Manitoba landscape and climate, it's very different. This is what the area around Winnipeg looked like about 6 weeks ago. It's relatively dry, only about 20 inches of rainfall a year and snow altogether. Cold, 80 to 90% of our runoff occurs as snowmelt. Very little rainfall runoff, and it's also in a relatively flat landscape, so that combination flat, dry, and cold means we actually have a relatively low risk of water erosion in our landscape and climate. And as a result, we see most of the phosphorus loading in the Red River. This is just before it enters Lake Winnipeg, occurs in the month of April. When that snowmelt occurs, that's when Lake Winnipeg gets loaded up with phosphorus in that snowmelt runoff. So what are the differences between rainfall runoff and snowmelt runoff? Why am I making a big deal of the snowmelt runoff? It's a completely different physical process. And I'll just outline a little bit. You guys know a lot about this already, I'm sure. But rainfall runoff starts with that splash of that raindrop on the surface, which gets that soil starting to move. There's a little bit of water that can infiltrate to the point where it runs into a stream or a river through the subsurface pathway, but most of it's going to run off the surface, and it's going to interact with that soil and carry some of that soil through erosion. A little bit of release of soluble phosphorus from the residue in the soil and the surface. The areas near the streams are growing with vegetation and can intercept nutrients, and that's sort of the way the rainfall system works. If we take a look at snowmelt, sort of like two phases. From November until March, at least out our way, we store our precipitation in the form of snow, and then we move it all over the landscape. Every time it blows, the snow moves around, and it tends to accumulate in these depressional areas, which are the most hydrologically active. Then we wait until March and let it thaw in a couple of weeks, and it all leaves that landscape. There's no splash, and very little infiltration because the soil is frozen, so there's very little leaching. The soil is about as hard as pavement during most of that melt process, so we get very little displacement of the soil particles, but we get a lot of phosphorus release from vegetative residues that have gone through that freezing and thawing process. And then when that water gets near the stream, there's almost no near stream or in-stream processes to intercept that phosphorus. It's basically going down like a concrete trough through our water system. So here's an illustration. A postdoctoral fellow who's standing in the middle of a water pathway. That flow path, he's not even sinking in with his boots, right? So there's just not much erosion on our soils anyways. They're still usually really frozen. So when we take a look at the relationship between phosphorus loss and soil erosion risk in 14 watersheds in Manitoba, this work, did anybody follow Burr and Mulla studies from about 15 years ago? They did something like this in Minnesota. They were looking at the relationship between phosphorus loss in these regional watersheds and their phosphorus index. Well, we did the same thing in Manitoba because we just copied, but we used Manitoba data. Those 14 watersheds in Manitoba, there was no relationship between soil erosion and total phosphorus loss. Erosion is just not related to phosphorus loss in our situation. And it shouldn't have taken that study to figure this out. All you have to do is go up in a plane and take a look at the landscape. Here's the Red River Valley in an unusually wet year, 2005. And you can see these shallow closed basins. And the only sort of flow paths that are established by erosion are where farmers actually have gone in there and scraped ditches out. Because the natural erosion over the last 10,000 years has not resulted in a dendritic sort of flow network. And here's our potholes. The depressions are deeper, but it's the same underdeveloped landscape. Not much erosion over the last 10,000 years to carve out those pathways. So we just don't have a lot of erosion in our landscapes. So how does this snowmelt runoff affect our beneficial management practices? This is the key thing. What are we going to be recommending farmers to do, or what are we going to be regulating them to do, or whatever it is, rewarding them to do? There's a difference between rainfall runoff and snowmelt. We usually put our toolboxes for water quality into two types of categories. We've got transport BMPs and source BMPs. The source BMPs are in-field management of nutrients, like the 4 R's in nutrient management, the rate, placement, timing, source of nutrients that we use. But they also have transport BMPs designed to prevent those nutrients from making it from the field to the stream. We've got conservation tillage, vegetative buffers, cover crops, perennial forage, constructed wetlands and small reservoirs to manage the water. Those are typical, like I say, transport BMPs. So we're going to start with the transport BMPs because that's a very important toolbox and a big difference from rainfall runoff to snowmelt runoff in this particular package. When we looked at conservation tillage and the South Tobacco Creek model watershed that David mentioned, we found that conservation tillage reduced nitrogen export by 68%, reduced sediment export by 65%, but it increased phosphorus loss, didn't decrease it. And we were surprised by that. This project was started more or less to demonstrate to farmers how they could improve water quality with conservation tillage. But what did we find? If we took a look at this 2 watershed study, and that one watershed that stayed in conventional tillage, then there was one watershed that was going to be converted over to conservation tillage. Prior to instituting the conservation tillage, we actually had very little erosion. This is the amount of particulate phosphorus coming off of those 2 watersheds. It's relatively small compared to the dissolved phosphorus. We usually didn't have an erosion problem in that particular situation. So when we introduced conservation tillage, we decreased our little bit of a problem with the particulate phosphorus, but we increased our problem with the dissolved phosphorus. And what happened was we increased overall phosphorus losses by 12% on a per acre basis and the concentrations by 42% by moving to conservation tillage. And you might think, oh, that's heresy, let's burn this guy at the stake. But this is not unusual. Neil Hansen, we were talking about Neil, has observed similar increases in the dissolved phosphorus fraction in the conservation tillage system. And if that's your dominant form of loss, you've got to pay respect to that observation. Where's it coming from? We think it's coming a lot from the vegetative residues. We did some sampling, and these blue bars represent the amount of phosphorus, water-soluble phosphorus that came out of the vegetation in late fall, and the black bars represent the amount of water-soluble phosphorus coming out of the soil. But wherever we had conservation tillage, we had a lot more water-soluble phosphorus in that vegetation than we had in the soil. This is fall 2004, 2005, and 2006. Lots of water-soluble phosphorus ready to go with snowmelt. Andrew Sharpley, the fellow I referred to earlier, and the current president of the Soil Science Society of America, so I'm going to respect his authority on this. He measured something very similar in his trials in Oklahoma. He found that there was an increase in the dissolved phosphorus when he converted this watershed over to no-till wheat. But he had so much erosion on that site that when we looked at the total phosphorus losses, converting to no-till dropped his overall losses dramatically. He had a soil erosion problem with water, and he controlled that erosion problem and reduced the phosphorus loss enormously. But he had an erosion problem. Andrew Sharpley continues to publish. Here's something that he co-authored with Helen Jarvie and David Baker, who's in Ohio. Just published in January this year. Increased soluble phosphorus loads to Lake Erie, unintended consequences of conservation practices. Soluble phosphorus loads in the Maumee River Basin, for example, making for big problems with Lake Erie's water quality because we're not always being sensitive to an individual situation. Is it an erosion-caused problem or is it a dissolved phosphate problem? We need to distinguish those two situations very carefully. When we take a look at the residues, we see the greatest loss in terms of pounds of phosphorus per acre if we have green residue going into the freeze-up period. This is new forage or winter wheat, riparian grasses or perennial or old perennial forage. If we look at old wheat and flax stubble, we don't see much phosphorus loss. It's the green material, fresh frozen green material. Does anybody here store their lettuce in a freezer? No. Fresh green material doesn't do well when it comes out thawed. It turns to mush, and that's where we get a lot of our risk of phosphorus loss. There was another study, runoff study, that a postdoctoral fellow did with Heather Sharpley in Pennsylvania several years ago, almost 15 years ago. And she found that when she put a cover crop over top of the manured soil in this particular trial, she reduced phosphorus loss in this rainfall simulation study. But being from Norway, Marianne Beckman decided that she would freeze the soil and the cover crop and the manure and then run the rainfall simulator again. And there was a little bit more loss from the soil or the manured soil when she when she ran the rainfall simulator right after it had been frozen. But with the cover crop, the losses went up tenfold because that cover crop's vegetative phosphorus went down with that runoff water. And when she thawed the soil and then ran the runoff, she still ended up with a tenfold increase in phosphorus loss with the cover crop compared to without. Something that's kind of hasn't been discussed very much with our enthusiasm, for cover crops. When we take a look at our perennial forage issue in Manitoba, we had 2 sets of fields that were in perennial forage crop alfalfa, 2 sets of fields in cultivated annual crops, and then we switched them around for a total of 8 site years worth of data. And the losses from the perennial forage in terms of phosphorus in snowmelt, 2.5 times as much phosphorus coming off the perennial forage compared to cultivated annual crops. Is this new? Well, not necessarily. Larry Bundy and Tiffany Robertson from the University of Wisconsin published some work about 10 years ago or so. Anyways, and they found in their rainfall simulations that there was a lot of phosphorus loss in this rainfall simulation. If they had frozen and thawed vegetation or dried vegetation, that water-soluble peat released to the runoff. But when they looked at what was going on in the field, they did not see that same effect. And this is very important. They looked at alfalfa removed compared to the full growth of alfalfa, and they found that there was no more phosphorus loss in the dissolved form with the full growth of alfalfa. And that was because they felt that the timing and the extent of plant freezing relative to rainfall events made the difference. If you have rainfall on fresh frozen perennial forage residue and it washes the water-soluble phosphorus out of that residue into the soil before it freezes, you might be just fine. So this type of response to the vegetative P depends a lot on weather conditions during that freeze-up event and that thaw event. Vegetative buffers, which I know is a contentious issue here in Minnesota, because you're going through some discussion of your state regulations, from what I can understand from the people that have been writing this, from both sides of that debate. We had a study in Manitoba, published in 2006, where the vegetative buffer strips reduced runoff P in 50% of the cases, but they increased the P in 18% of the cases, had no effect in 32% of the cases. We expanded that study to include a variety of other types of landscapes, and there was no significant reduction in P in that second study on 17 out of the 18 seasonal measurements. When we looked at paired measurements of phosphorus concentrations just upstream from the vegetative buffer strip to like 3 meters, 10 feet into the buffer strip, we only had 1 out of 18 circumstances where we saw any benefit in terms of phosphorus reduction. Here's what the data looks like. It's just simple concentration data, and the points above this line here represent numerical increases in concentration from the buffer. Points below the line represent numerical reductions in this form of phosphorus going through the buffer. You can see the particulate phosphorus. There may be a tendency in a few cases for the particulate phosphorus to be less if it's going through the buffer, but we like to look at the differences in dissolved P. There's tendencies, maybe in a few cases it might look like there's numerical increases in dissolved phosphorus being picked up from that vegetation during snowmelt. And overall, not too much difference. In most of the cases, really no difference in the total phosphorus going through that vegetative buffer in these Manitoba studies in terms of the concentrations. And is that really a shock? Well, here's what those vegetative buffers look like during the snowmelt process. Remember, snowmelt accounts for 80 to 90% of our runoff, and here's what it looks like. There's no vegetative growth, there's no infiltration. This is a completely different system coming from a summer rainfall situation. And that needs to be accounted for when we look at this as a BMP. Is this new? No, it is not. In Vermont, there was a study published 25 years ago by Schellinger and Clausen, and they looked at the performance of vegetative buffers for intercepting barnyard waste, barnyard runoff, I should say. They looked at suspended solids, total phosphorus, and total nitrogen. These green bars represent interception or retention of these components in the runoff during the growing season. These blue bars represent a net increase in those constituents because of the buffer strip flowing during the period outside of the growing season. There's actually this net contribution of suspended solids, phosphorus, and nitrogen outside that growing season. And if this is your major flow of water, this is a really important sort of situation to acknowledge. And if we look historically, we'll see in this review by Guiteau that conservation tillage and riparian buffers, these transport BMPs, do have a wide range of performance. On average, the riparian buffers seem to work, but there's a wide range in performance. In some cases, they increase the loss of dissolved phosphorus. Certainly the same thing with conservation tillage, with a tendency for more dissolved phosphorus to be lost with conservation tillage than with conventional or high-intensity tillage. So, another issue then, let's talk about water management. Like David mentioned, we need to manage the water. Small reservoirs in our South Tobacco Creek model watershed reduce sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus significantly. We're not exactly sure what mechanisms are accounting for that, but small dams and reservoirs showing benefits. We showed that if you have a small reservoir downstream from an animal handling facility like corrals on this farm, you might be able to reduce watershed phosphorus loading by 50% if you can take that reservoir water in the middle of the growing season and apply it onto the agricultural land where those nutrients in that water can be used. David is working with a farmer in the Red River Valley who's consolidating his drainage into a drainage basin and then trying to recycle that water for late season irrigation. That's another, I think, opportunity to intercept nutrients. At a grander scale, we have some large reservoirs along the Saskatchewan River system that intercept about 90% of the phosphorus that's loaded into the Saskatchewan River is intercepted in Lake Diefenbaker behind the Gardner Dam, behind the Codet, the Tobin reservoirs in Saskatchewan, and Cedar Lake in Manitoba. These large-scale reservoirs are also intercepting large amounts of phosphorus. So we're looking at these BMPs, transport BMPs. We see some potential for water management BMPs to be beneficial. These ones here, not necessarily providing a lot of benefit in terms of intercepting phosphorus in particular. But what about our, other than source BMPs, if these ones aren't working very well, what about our nutrient management BMPs? Maybe we should be emphasizing those a little bit more. And in fact, if you take a look at Guiteau's review, you're going to find that manure management, improving that, and nutrient management planning are surefire ways of improving our water quality footprint in agriculture. When we take a look at the soil test phosphorus levels in soil, and we take a look at the runoff phosphorus that we see in runoff simulation studies, we see a very strong relationship between soil test phosphorus and that runoff phosphorus. When we take a look at the watersheds, 14 regional watersheds in Manitoba, the soil test P levels in those watersheds strongly related to the total P in the soil. The soil test P strongly related to the total P in the runoff water in the streams. So we know that we need to be careful to balance our phosphorus application with removal, and we don't want to be applying excess amounts of phosphorus. This is a bigger challenge for our livestock producers than for our crop producers using commercial fertilizers, and it's because the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus in manure isn't quite right as far as what you put on an annual basis for a crop, and it means that application of manure to meet the crop set requirements results in several years of P application, so you can really only apply manure periodically to any particular parcel of land. As far as phosphorus placement goes, which is another part of the nutrient management sort of package, we place most of our phosphorus fertilizer in or near the seed row because we're farming on the edge of agriculture in North America. We have a very short growing season. We have to get that crop out of the ground as quickly as possible. The soils are really cold, and so we need that phosphorus fertilizer placed in or near the seed row. And that works out beneficially to the environment because we've got that phosphorus placed after runoff has occurred and under the soil surface. When you take a look at manure placement, in Manitoba, 60% of the solid manures and 83% of the liquid manures are injected or incorporated. We have very little surface application of manure in the province, so that's a good thing. In terms of timing, we know that applying manure on frozen soil or snow is bad environmentally and agronomically. It's very well documented in the literature. In Manitoba, winter application of manure has been prohibited for large livestock operations since 1999, and a universal ban came in for manure and commercial fertilizer in 2013. It is illegal in Manitoba to apply manure or fertilizer between November the 10th and April the 10th, unless there's some special situation where we get an early thaw or a very late freeze. So just to summarize, the biggest cause of water quality problems in our freshwater systems is excess phosphorus. And many small sources of phosphorus contribute to the problem, so it's not going to be just, we've got to get the city of Winnipeg to implement stricter wastewater treatment. Everybody's going to have to do something to help contribute, correct the problem. Agriculture needs to find ways to reduce its share of phosphorus loading, and especially during snowmelt runoff, that's a challenging situation. The processes and the BMPs that control phosphorus loss during snowmelt runoff are much different from those that control phosphorus loss during rainfall runoff, and we've got to account for that difference. In terms of the source BMPs, there's lots of tried and true nutrient management BMPs that we can be using: the right source, right place, right timing, and right rate. And we want to avoid excess applications of P, winter applications of fertilizer, manure, or fall broadcasts of phosphate fertilizer without incorporation. In terms of transport BMPs, that's where we still have lots of questions. Intercepting the nutrients is much more challenging in a snowmelt-driven runoff system. And if erosion is not the main cause of phosphorus loss in our situation, erosion control measures such as conservation tillage, perennial forages, vegetative buffers will do little to reduce P loss. But if you've got an erosion problem, you should be using all those practices. But if you don't have an erosion problem, you should be much more careful with implementing. Careful selection and management of BMPs is required to avoid increasing phosphorus losses, partly because vegetation is sometimes a P source instead of a phosphorus sink. So, the main message is not necessarily to take this information literally as applying to Minnesota. We've got measurements from Saskatchewan and Manitoba and the northern Great Plains, but we don't have measurements from Minnesota. So the BMPs require local investigation validation to ensure that they actually work, and that's very important. Outsourced science, even if it comes from friendly professors from Manitoba, should not be followed blindly. Just a warning. Computer models, oh my goodness, I won't even get going on those. But the BMPs need to be validated for that local circumstances. And one of the things that I want to show some respect for is Minnesota has a wide range of ecozones, where you've got some parts of your state that are probably very similar to us, and some parts of your state that are very different from us. And that's going to be a huge challenge for the science people. It's going to be a huge challenge to the regulatory and policy people as well. So I don't want to show any disrespect for the diversity of situations that you have to wrestle with here in Minnesota. I also want to stress how important it is to not look at these practices too narrow-mindedly. Even though I am really interested in phosphorus, doesn't mean that the only thing important in the world is phosphorus. At least that's what people tell me. Phosphorus is one part of our water quality sort of criteria, but there's all sorts of other environmental issues. Biodiversity and natural habitat. Vegetative buffers are excellent for natural habitat, and biodiversity, and stream bank stabilization, and those other sort of things. So we need to be broad-minded about that. And when we're looking at long-term sustainability, it can't be just environmentally sustainable, it has to be economically and socially sustainable. So we have to be much more broad-minded. And towards that end, I'd like us to start to get away from looking at these panacea, one-size-fits-all kind of solutions. There's no one single beneficial management practice, conservation, tillage, perennial forage, vegetative, this cure-all for all of our environmental issues and situations. We have to be realistic. The BMPs have different effects on different issues. Something that's really good for preventing nitrate leaching might create problems for phosphorus loss to surface water, or vice versa. Different environments, sloping land versus level land, snowmelt runoff versus rainfall runoff, all these situations require some finesse. Trade-offs and synergies are inevitable. Let's use knowledge and science. Tomorrow there's a national science demonstration.
Well, it's Earth Day.
Earth Day.
And then March for Science Month.
March for Science, there we go.
And Mark Seeley's going to be
That's great, but we need to use our scientific knowledge to maximize the synergies and minimize the trade-offs. And if we don't acknowledge these side effects, it could really backfire on us. So I'm advocating that we start looking at environmental health more like human health, and look for a lot more sort of care when it comes to detecting a cause. Assessing more cases on an individual basis and comprehensively, not assuming that everybody has a problem with blood clots and everybody should be taking warfarin just because I do. Identify the real cause of the most important problems and treat it as a high priority, and be willing to accept maybe some of the negative side effects. Prescribing the right cure, make sure the cure works. Treat with precision. The surgeon cuts you with a knife, so does a mugger in a back alley, but you're hoping that the surgeon has more precision. Consider all the benefits and all the side effects. What if our agricultural BMPs were advertised on television like those drugs are? Good cause, blah, 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 blah. And then we need to continuously monitor, adapt, and fine-tune the treatments. In some circumstances, like Lake Erie's problems within Ohio's portion of the watershed, phosphorus placement, improved phosphorus placement, would do enormous benefit to cutting down their phosphorus problem. One little fine-tuning BMP, and it could be a lot better. And with that, I want to thank all the many people, including David, who have helped contribute to our work in Manitoba, and look forward to the opportunity to discuss some of these things at greater length with you in the discussion period afterwards. Okay?